The brand didn't burn the way she expected. She had imagined fire, searing, immediate, consuming. The kind of pain that announced itself with a scream and left no room for thought. But when Alpha Norman pressed the iron to the base of her throat, the place where her voice lived, where every note she had ever sung had risen and fallen and filled spaces larger than herself, it was cold first, cold and deliberate, the way cruelty always was when it had rehearsed itself. Then it bloomed, not outward, inward. A deep, spreading heat that moved down through her collarbone and into her chest, like something trying to reach her heart and choke it from the inside. Dahlia's knees hit the stone floor of the assembly hall before she could stop them. The crowd blurred at the edges of her vision. Dozens of pack members she had grown up alongside, people whose children she had sung to sleep, people who had clapped for her at festivals and wept openly at burial ceremonies when her voice carried the grief of the whole pack. And now they watched in silence. Not one of them moved. Not one of them stepped forward. "This is not real," she thought wildly. "This cannot be real." Dahlia of the Moonscar Pack. Norman's voice rang out above her, smooth and practiced, the voice of a man who had staged this moment carefully and was now performing it with precision. "You have broken the treaties of 4 allied packs. You have embarrassed this pack before our neighbors. You have placed personal comfort above the survival of your people." He paused. Let the silence do its work. The assembly hall had been built for moments like this. High stone walls that caught sound and held it, and torches in iron brackets throwing long shadows across the faces of the crowd. Dahlia had sung in this hall. She had stood on this very floor at 11 years old and sung until every person in the room had gone completely still, moved in the way that only great music moved people, in the way that reached past thought and into the body itself. She remembered that night. The way the applause had come like a wave breaking. The way her father had looked at her mother with something close to reverence. She thought of that now, kneeling on the same stone, and the gap between that memory and this moment was so vast she felt briefly dizzy. "You are hereby branded traitor." The word landed like a stone dropped into still water. She felt it ripple through the crowd. She felt it pass through her own chest like something physical, something with weight and edge and intention. Traitor. She looked up. Norman stood above her with the cooling iron still in his hand, and his expression was not angry. That was the thing she would remember most, later, when she had put enough distance between herself and this moment to think clearly. He was not angry. He was satisfied. The flat contained satisfaction of a man whose plan had concluded exactly as designed. She had been the plan. She pressed one hand against the stone floor and forced herself upright. Her throat screamed. The brand would scar. She already knew it, already felt the way the skin around the mark had tightened and begun its terrible work of healing wrong. Norman had chosen the location deliberately, the hollow of her throat, the seat of her voice, as if he could mark the thing that had always belonged to her and make it his even in its destruction. She met his eyes. Norman was not a large man. He had always compensated for that with volume, with theater, with the particular cruelty of men who needed to remind rooms that they were dangerous. But standing above her now, his satisfaction showed the truth of him more clearly than anything else she had witnessed in 3 years of service. He had needed this spectacle, this public diminishment, this branding, not because pack law required it, but because she had refused him, because she had looked at him and said no, and men like Norman could not survive a no without answering it with something that could not be answered back. "Punishment will be determined by the council," he continued, already turning away, already dismissing her with the movement of his body before the sentence had finished leaving his mouth, as though she were already decided, already finished. "He thinks this is over," she realized. "He thinks I will stay here and receive this." She looked out at the crowd one final time. She found her parents in the second row. Her mother's face was turned slightly to the side, not quite looking away but not quite looking at her either, existing in the careful in-between of a woman who had made her choice and was now managing the discomfort of it. Her father stood with his jaw set and his eyes fixed on a point somewhere above Dahlia's head, as though the ceiling required his urgent attention. They had chosen their council seats. They had chosen Norman. Something in Dahlia's chest that had been straining toward them for the last year, reaching, hoping, waiting for the moment they would finally turn around and see what was happening to her, went quiet. Not broken. Just finished. The way a door closes. She turned and ran. She had not always been someone who ran. 3 years earlier, Dahlia had been exactly what her parents hoped she would be. Grateful, obedient, luminous in the way that useful things are luminous. The way a lamp is luminous, burning steadily and well for whoever needed the light, not for itself. She had been 20 years old when Alpha Norman first summoned her. She remembered standing outside his receiving room with her mother's hands smoothing the front of her dress, her father's quiet pride filling the corridor like warmth from a hearth. Her mother kept adjusting the collar of her blouse. Small, anxious touches. Unnecessary. Something to do with hands that didn't know what else to do. "This is it," her mother had whispered. "Everything we hoped for." Dahlia had believed it too. Norman's receiving room smelled of cedar and old ambition. He had been seated behind a table that was wider than it needed to be. Everything about Norman was slightly wider, slightly more formal, slightly more staged than the situation required, as if he decorated his own life to impress an audience that wasn't there. He looked at her the way collectors look at acquisitions, not with desire, with appraisal, that careful, measuring stillness. "You have a gift," he said, not a compliment, an observation. "Thank you, Alpha." "Your pack has a gift," he corrected gently and smiled. And that was the first time she felt the small, cold thing shift in the back of her mind. The thing she would spend the next 3 years trying to convince herself she was imagining. He told her his vision. She would sing at his court events. Visiting alphas, merchants, dignitaries would hear her and carry the reputation of Moonscar to other territories. Her parents would be elevated to his council. It was, he said, an honor and an opportunity and a service to her people, all at once and inseparable. "What will I be paid?" she asked. Norman smiled again, patient, indulgent, the smile of a man explaining something obvious to someone who had simply not yet understood. "When I am convinced the gift has been fully realized, when the pack has seen the return of what you offer. You understand this is about more than coin, Dahlia. This is about legacy." She understood later that this meant never. But at 20, standing in the warmth of her parents' pride, with her father's eyes bright and her mother's hand still warm on her collar, she nodded and thanked him and told herself it was an honor. The first event was a moon ceremony for a neighboring pack. She sang 3 songs and the hall went so quiet she could hear the torches breathing. When she finished, the applause came in a wave, full and immediate, the kind that didn't require encouragement but simply erupted. She stood there in the light of it and felt, briefly, like everything was possible. Norman had clapped her on the shoulder on the way out, the way one claps a horse after a good race. "Well done, you served your pack tonight." She had smiled and thanked him. The second event she had not been told about until the morning of it. A carriage had arrived at her cottage before dawn. A guard at her door with a simply stated instruction. "The Alpha requires your presence tonight." She had gone, half-dressed and breathless, and was still pulling pins from her hair in the carriage, arriving with barely enough time to warm her voice before she was expected to perform. She sang beautifully. She always sang beautifully. That was the problem. The events multiplied the way small problems multiply when left unmonitored. Gradually, then suddenly. 2 events in a month became 4. 4 became 6. Norman began accepting invitations from distant packs, who paid him handsomely to bring his singer, and he accepted those invitations without consulting her, without a word of warning, without the basic courtesy of asking whether she was physically able to perform. She was never asked whether she was able. She began waking with her throat raw. A persistent ache settled behind her sternum, the kind of deep physical warning the body issues when it is being taken past its limits. Not a suggestion, but a command, the body insisting on itself. She started taking honey and ginger every morning before dawn. Standing at her cottage window in the gray half-light, trying to coax her voice back to readiness before the next carriage arrived. One morning she sang a single warming scale and heard it, the faintest crack in her upper register, a thin, glassy fracture in the notes she had always trusted completely. She stood very still in her cottage kitchen with the sound of her own broken voice fading in the air, and felt a fear she had no name for yet. She went to the healer. The healer listened to her voice, pressed careful fingers against her throat, asked her how many performances in the last month. When Dahlia told her, the woman's expression shifted into something guarded and deliberate. Continued overuse, she said carefully, may cause permanent damage. Dahlia sat with those words in the silence of her cottage for a long time after she left. Permanent. She went to Norman. He received her in the same wide room, behind the same wide table. She told him what the healer had said. She told him she needed rest between events, needed advance notice so she could prepare and pace herself properly. She told him this calmly and clearly, the way she had rehearsed it on the walk to his door, her voice steady, her hands relaxed at her sides. Norman listened. He nodded slowly when she finished, the nod of a man performing consideration he had no intention of acting on. You understand, he said, that 3 packs in the Eastern Territory are expecting you at their Spring Alliance celebration. Alpha. You understand, he continued, his voice dropping into something soft and immovable, the register of a man who had learned that quiet authority was more effective than raised voices. That your father sits on my council because of what you bring to this pack. That the standing your family has earned, the respect, the security, exists because of your gift. The small, cold thing moved again. I understand, she said quietly, but my voice is... Your voice, Norman said, leaning forward slightly, his pale eyes absolutely level, belongs to this pack. She walked home in the dark. She stood in her cottage with her hands pressed flat against the kitchen table and breathed until the shaking stopped. She thought about her parents, her father's new confidence, her mother's relief, the way both of them had stopped apologizing for things they'd always apologized for before Norman's council seats changed their lives. She thought about the crack in her upper register. She thought about the word permanent. She thought about whose hands her gift was in and what those hands intended to do with it. And she made her decision quietly, in the dark, alone, without telling anyone. The next event Norman sent a carriage for without notice, she sent the carriage back empty. The silence from the pack house lasted 2 days. Then Norman summoned her and she went. And he told her precisely what she had cost him, naming amounts and alliances and damaged relationships with the specificity of a man keeping a running ledger. She stood with her hands clasped and her chin level and held her ground. I need advance notice, she said. I need rest between events. I need a contract. A contract, he repeated, and the word in his mouth sounded like something faintly obscene. Yes. She refused the next unannounced event, then another, then a third. Word reached her through pack whispers that an Eastern alliance had threatened to withdraw, that another alpha had called Norman unreliable, that there was talk, the specific dangerous kind of talk that rippled through pack territories like weather, of consequences. She had not known then how far Norman would reach for those consequences. She knew now. She ran through the forest with the brand cooling at her throat, and the word traitor ringing in her skull, and she did not look back once. Not at the hall. Not at the torches. Not at her parents' carefully averted faces. She had a small roll of coins in her cottage, emergency savings built quietly over months, wrapped in cloth and tucked beneath a loose board near the hearth. She had started saving the day after the healer's warning, some instinct in her understanding, before her conscious mind would admit it, that this moment was coming. She returned for the coins in the gray hour before dawn, moving through the trees like smoke. She took her coins and her warmest cloak and her mother's old shawl, the one that still held the faint smell of healer's herbs from when her mother used to mix remedies in their kitchen when Dahlia was small. She pressed her nose to it once in the dark of her cottage. Then she folded it carefully and put it in her pack. She did not take anything Norman had ever given her. There was nothing, she realized, standing in the doorway of the cottage she would not see again, that he ever truly had. She crossed the pack border as the sun broke over the tree line, and felt the bond thin behind her with each step. Felt it stretch and narrow, like thread pulled past its limit. The invisible cord of belonging that every pack wolf carried without knowing it until the moment it began to go. She walked until she couldn't feel it anymore, until it snapped. The silence inside her was enormous, but beneath it, beneath the grief and the terror and the raw wound at her throat that throbbed with every heartbeat, something else was there. Something she recognized from the moment she had first refused Norman, from the moment she had stood in that wide room and said, "I need a contract," and watched his expression shift. Small, quiet, permanent. Freedom felt in those first miles less like liberation and more like falling. The road ahead was unknown. She had no pack, no protection, no name that meant anything in the territories she was walking toward. She had a voice the healer had warned her about, and a brand on her throat that would mark her as outcast to any wolf who looked closely enough. She turned her face toward the road and walked anyway. She didn't know yet that freedom, for a woman with a voice like hers, was only the beginning of the story. She didn't know that somewhere in a distant kingdom, in the noise and color of an ordinary marketplace, a man in a commoner's clothes was going to stop walking when he heard her sing. That he would stand very still in the middle of a crowd and listen with the particular attention of someone who understood exactly what they were hearing. She didn't know what that meeting would cost her, or what it would give her, or how completely it would rewrite everything she believed about what her voice was worth. She only knew she was still breathing, and that her voice, despite everything Norman had tried to make of it, was still hers, still whole, still free. But before Kelvrath, there had been the road, 3 weeks of it. The kind of road that has no interest in where you came from or where you are going, that simply exists beneath your feet, and asks only that you keep moving. Dahlia had kept moving, through border territories that smelled of pine resin and unfamiliar earth, through villages where no one knew the name Moonscar, and no one looked at her throat long enough to read what was on it. She slept in wayfarers' lodges when her coins allowed, and beneath wide trees when they didn't, wrapped in her mother's shawl with her pack for a pillow. She sang on the third day, not for coin, but because the silence had become something she needed to break. She had been afraid to. Afraid that when she opened her mouth, the crack she had heard in her upper register that last terrible morning would have deepened, widened, swallowed whatever Norman had not managed to destroy with iron. She opened her mouth. The sound moved through the trees and kept going. Not broken, not diminished. If anything. And she stood very still when she understood this, fuller than before, as though whatever the moon goddess had placed in her at birth had simply refused to be touched by what Norman had pressed against her skin. The brand had scarred, a raised ridge of tightened skin at the hollow of her throat that her fingers found sometimes in the night without her meaning to reach for it. He had believed the iron would take something essential from her, that if he could mark the place where the voice lived, he could diminish what lived there. He had been wrong. He couldn't take what the moon goddess gave. He thought it was mine to lose. It isn't. It was never that fragile. She picked up her pack and kept walking. She reached Kelvrath on the 7th day. A proper market town, enough foot traffic to make a singer invisible between performances, enough commerce to make coin realistic, and enough transient population that a woman with no local history attracted no particular scrutiny. She walked its main street twice before deciding. This one, not permanently. That part of her was still too raw, too recently uprooted to trust the concept of staying, but long enough to rest, to let the brand finish healing, to take stock of herself in conditions that weren't moving. She found the cottage through the old woman at the grain stall, who knew everyone's business and shared most of it freely. A widow on the eastern outskirt. Modest but clean and quiet. The widow asked no questions beyond whether Dahlia could pay the first week ahead. And Dahlia could, barely. And that was the entirety of the arrangement. 2 rooms, a small hearth, a window that faced east and caught the morning light. The widow left a jug of water and a heel of bread on the table the first night without being asked, and did not remark on the brand at Dahlia's throat. And Dahlia sat at that table in the quiet of someone else's home, and felt, for the first time since leaving Moonscar, that she could breathe all the way down. She sang in Kelvrath Marketplace 4 days later, once her legs had stopped aching. The spot between the spice merchant and the cloth stalls that caught sound the way a cupped hand catches water. The first day she made enough coin for 2 days' food. The second day, more. By the end of the week, she had paid the widow 2 weeks ahead and had enough left to begin rebuilding her emergency savings in the cloth pouch inside her boot. Small. Slow. Hers entirely. Dahlia had been singing in the Kelvrath Marketplace for 11 days by then, long enough to know which cobblestones were uneven, which vendor would slip her a warm roll when trade was slow, and exactly which spot between the spice merchant and the cloth stalls caught sound the way a cupped hand catches water, holding it, amplifying it, sending it out in all directions at once. She had learned to read crowds the way sailors read weather. She knew which songs loosened coin from closed fists, which ones made people pause mid-stride and turn without knowing why, which ones reached into strangers and found something they hadn't known was waiting to be found. She sang those ones carefully, rationing them the way a traveler rations water in dry country. Too much of the best of herself, and her throat would pay for it. She had learned that lesson the hard way. She was 3 songs into her morning when she felt it. Not heard. Felt. The particular quality of being truly listened to. It was different from being enjoyed. Different from the pleasant distraction she provided for people passing between stalls with their minds on other things. This was attention with weight to it. Attention that had stopped moving and committed itself entirely. She had felt it before, in her best performances, when an entire hall went still. But this was a single person, and the focus of it was so complete and so quiet that it pulled at the edges of her awareness the way a candle pulls at the eye in a dark room. She finished the song before she let herself look. He was standing at the edge of her natural audience. Not close. Not performing interest for anyone else's benefit. Just standing with his arms relaxed at his sides and his full attention on her. He was dressed plainly. A dark coat, unremarkable. The kind of clothing that was meant to be forgotten. His face was, she noticed this before she could stop herself, arranged in an expression she rarely saw directed at her singing. Not pleasure, exactly. Not the polite appreciation of someone being entertained. Something more like recognition. The way one craftsman looks at the work of another. He was perhaps 30. Perhaps a handful of years more. Dark-haired, broad across the shoulders, with the stillness of someone who did not spend their energy carelessly. When her last note dissolved into the marketplace noise, he stepped forward. He placed a coin on the cloth she spread for payment, and Dahlia looked at it, looked at him. "That's too much," she said. "It isn't." His voice was even, unhurried. Not for what that was. She studied him the way she had learned to study people since leaving Moonscar. Quickly, thoroughly, with the particular wariness of a woman who had trusted the wrong assessments before. He didn't have the look of trouble. He had the look of someone accustomed to being in control of themselves, which was different, and in her experience sometimes more dangerous. "I don't know you," she said. "No." He didn't seem bothered by this. "My name is Ranulph. I've been listening to you for several days." The wariness sharpened. She kept her expression neutral. "I'm not interested in a manager," she said, "or a patron, or any arrangement that involves someone else making decisions about where I sing." Something moved through his expression. Not offense, she thought. Closer to understanding, as though she had confirmed something he had suspected. "I'm not offering any of those things," he said. "I'm telling you that what you do is exceptional, and that you are worth considerably more than marketplace coins. You don't know what I'm worth." "No," he agreed again, with the same undisturbed calm. "But I know what I heard. And what I heard was someone who hasn't yet been given the conditions to discover their own ceiling." She looked at him for a long moment. The marketplace moved around them. The calls of vendors, the smell of spiced meat and fresh bread, the clatter of a dropped pot somewhere behind her. She was aware of all of it, and of none of it. She was aware only of this man, and the specific quality of what he was saying, and the fact that a voice in the back of her mind that had been silent for months was now awake and alert and paying attention. "This is how it starts," another part of her said flatly. "This is exactly how it starts." She had been here before. Not precisely here, not this marketplace or this man. But the shape of it was familiar. The person who saw potential, who had words for what made her valuable, who stood in front of her with an offer that sounded like elevation. She knew what came after elevation, in her experience. She knew what the fine print looked like. "I'm not interested," she said, and began folding her cloth. He reached into his coat and produced a small disc, a seal she registered distantly, though she didn't know whose. It was carved from dark stone, smooth and cool-looking, with markings she couldn't read. "When you change your mind," he said, and placed it on the folded cloth with the same deliberateness with which he had placed his coin. "Come find me. I won't change my mind. Then keep it as a reminder that someone heard you properly." He stepped back. Something close to a smile, brief and genuine. "You have more than you know, Dahlia." She looked up sharply. She hadn't told him her name, but he was already turning, already moving back into the crowd with the same unhurried quality he had brought to everything else, and within a handful of seconds he was simply gone. Absorbed into the ordinary motion of the market as though he had never interrupted it, Dahlia stood with the seal in her hand and felt the wariness in her chest go several degrees colder. "He knew my name." She put the seal in her coat pocket, told herself she would throw it into the river on her way home, and sang 3 more songs to an audience that had no idea anything unusual had just happened. She didn't throw it in the river. She wasn't sure why. She put it on the small table near her cottage door, with the intention of dealing with it later. And then later became the next morning, and the next morning became a week, and the seal sat on her table and she walked past it every day without touching it. She wasn't keeping it, exactly. She just hadn't disposed of it yet. There was a difference. She was certain there was a difference. She was 3 weeks out of Kelvrath Market, moving between the smaller villages to the south, sleeping in whatever lodging her coins would stretch to cover, when the work of simply surviving began to press on her with a new and particular weight. Not hunger, she was managing that. Not cold. The season was still kind. It was something more interior than that. The loneliness of a life with no fixed point. No name that meant anything. No person in any room she entered who knew her history or cared about her future. She was a voice passing through places. That was all. She went back to her cottage to collect the few things she'd left there before moving on entirely, and found the seal on the floor near the hearth. It must have fallen from the table. She bent and picked it up and stood with it in her palm, looking at it in the thin afternoon light that came through her single window. The markings were intricate, more intricate than she'd noticed in the marketplace. They had been carved by someone who knew what they were doing, with a precision and patience that spoke of importance. She turned it over. The reverse was smooth except for a single impression at the center. A wolf's head, clean and authoritative. "Come find me," he had said, "when you make up your mind." She didn't know whose seal this was. She was a foreigner in this kingdom, still learning its shapes and hierarchies, still unable to read the signals that would have been obvious to anyone born here. She went to the cloth merchant in the village, a woman who had been kind to her, and showed her the seal. The woman's eyes went to it, and then away so quickly it was almost comical. She turned back to her bolts of fabric with sudden and absorbing interest. "I can't help you with that," she said. "Do you know whose seal it is?" "I think you should put that away." Dahlia tried the baker. He looked at it and physically stepped back, raising both hands as if she'd shown him something dangerous. The innkeeper's wife gave her a long, measuring look and said nothing at all. A young man near the well went pale and pointed without speaking toward the north road, then walked away at a pace that stopped just short of running. Dahlia stood in the village square with the seal in her closed fist and felt the specific, cold amusement of someone who had walked into something they didn't understand. "North Road," the young man had pointed. She took the north road. It wound uphill through sparse woodland, the trees thinning as the elevation rose until she came around a long curve and stopped entirely. Below her, set into the hillside like something that had grown from it rather than been built upon it, was a fortress. Stone walls the color of old bone, towers that rose without apology against the pale sky. It was not showy. It was the kind of structure that didn't need to be, the kind that communicated its own nature simply by existing and letting you understand that whatever was inside it had been inside it for a very long time and intended to remain. "No," her body said clearly and immediately. "Absolutely not. We are going back down the road." She turned. 2 guards materialized from the tree line behind her, as though they had been there all along. They were large, uniformed, and looking at her with the patient attention of men who had been watching her approach for some time. "State your name and purpose," the taller one said. Dahlia considered her options. They were limited. "My name is Dahlia. I have—" She opened her fist and looked at the seal. "I was given this by a man named Ranulph in the Kelvrath marketplace." The guards looked at each other. Something passed between them. Not alarm exactly, but a kind of heightened attention. "Show us," the taller one said. She held out the seal. They studied it for a long moment. The shorter guard's expression was skeptical in the specific way of someone performing skepticism over genuine uncertainty. The taller one looked at her with new and slightly uncomfortable carefulness. "Come with us," he said finally. "Come with us" led through the fortress gates and across a courtyard where wolves in various states of training moved and sparred, and went still when they saw her the same way people in the village had gone still. That same ripple of interrupted motion, eyes cutting to her, and then carefully away. She kept her face neutral and her chin up, and reminded herself that she had walked into a pack hall and stood her ground against an alpha's branding iron. And whatever this was, it was unlikely to be worse than that. The inside of the fortress was quiet and stone cool, all high corridors and controlled light. She was brought to a receiving hall and left there, the guards positioning themselves at the door with the particular stillness of people who had been told to wait. She waited. An elderly man appeared from a side passage, white-haired, unhurried, with the kind of face that had settled long ago into permanent thoughtfulness. He moved toward her without the wariness the others had shown, and looked at the seal in her hand with an expression that was something close to relief. "Where did you come by this?" he asked. "A man gave it to me, in Kelvrath. He said his name was Ranulph." The old man's mouth curved very slightly. "And he said to come find him when you had made up your mind?" She stared. "Yes. He always says that." He held out his hand. "Come, I'll take you to him." She heard him before she saw him. Not his voice. His presence, that particular quality of weight and stillness she recognized from the marketplace, translated now into the context of a room that was clearly his, filled with the evidence of a life that operated at a scale she had not prepared herself for. She stepped through the door. The elderly man opened and understood in the first 3 seconds that she had made a catastrophic miscalculation. The room was a war room. Maps covered the largest table, reports in neat stacks, the unmistakable material of governing. Not a room where someone worked for an authority, but a room where someone was the authority. Ranulph stood at the window with his back to her, still in the same plain coat, which struck her now as something she should have read differently. He turned. "You came," he said, and the calm in his voice was identical to what it had been in the marketplace, as though a fortress and a commoner's market were the same room to him, as though nothing about this required adjustment. "You're the Alpha King," Dahlia said. "I am." The floor felt slightly less solid than it had a moment ago. She had trusted the plainness of him. She had read his clothes and his unhurried manner and his lack of performance and concluded, ordinary man. She had been deceived before by men with elaborate trappings who turned out to be smaller than their costumes. She had apparently not considered that a man might be the opposite. Fool, she thought, with a clarity that had no heat in it. Just fact. "I should go," she said. "You could." He moved away from the window, toward the table, but not past it, keeping the distance respectful, she noticed, unhurried as always. "Or you could hear what I want to offer you." "I've heard offers before." "I know." Something in the way he said it made her go still. Not the words. 2 syllables, nothing remarkable. But the weight behind them. The acknowledgement in them. He was not pretending she was new to this. He was not asking her to forget whatever had taught her to refuse. "Whatever you're imagining," he said, "I'm not asking for ownership. I'm not asking for the right to send a carriage to your door without warning. I'm not asking for your voice in exchange for your family's comfort." He paused. "I'm asking you to let me introduce you to what your gift actually is, outside of whatever constraints have been placed on it. That's all." The brand on her throat pulsed, faintly the way old wounds pulse in cold weather. She thought of the healer's office. Permanent damage. She thought of her parents' averted faces. She thought of every carriage that had arrived before dawn, every event she hadn't been told about, every time she had been paid in legacy and honor instead of coin. She looked at this man, this king who had dressed like no one in a marketplace and listened to her with the attention of someone who understood exactly what he was hearing. "I need your terms on paper," she said. "I need them signed, with your seal." Something shifted in his expression. Not surprise, exactly. Closer to the look she had seen in the marketplace when she had first answered him. That quality of confirmation, of a thing being exactly what it appeared to be. "Name what you want in the contract," he said. "I'll sign whatever you write." Dahlia studied him for a long moment. The room was very quiet. Outside the window, she could hear the distant sound of the training courtyard, the ordinary noise of a place that ran on routine and purpose. "I'll need time to think," she said. "Take it. I'll need somewhere to stay that isn't contingent on my agreement." "Done." She looked for the catch. She looked for the small flicker of calculation behind the patience, and the moment where the performance slipped and showed the thing underneath. She had become very good at finding it. In Norman, it had taken her 3 years. She was faster now. She found nothing, which was either the best possible sign or the worst. "I'll give you my answer in the morning," she said. Ranulph nodded and stepped back, and called the elderly man to show her to her rooms. And that was all. No pressure. No final word designed to tip the balance. He simply let her go, as though the outcome was entirely hers, and he was genuinely comfortable with that. Dahlia followed the old man down the corridor and did not look back. But in the room they gave her, stone-walled, fire-lit, smelling of clean linen and old wood, she sat on the edge of the bed for a long time with the seal in her hand. Outside the window, the kingdom stretched dark and enormous in the night. "He knew your name before you told him," the cautious part of her said. "He dressed like no one," another part answered. "And he listened like someone who had nothing to prove." She turned the seal over. The wolf's head caught the firelight. She thought about the marketplace, about 11 days of coins on a cloth, about the crack in her upper register that had quietly healed in the weeks since she had stopped performing on Norman's schedule and started performing on her own, about what her voice might be, given the conditions to find out. She put the seal on the small table beside the bed. She lay down. She did not sleep for a long time. But when morning came, she knew her answer. The contract took her 2 hours to write. Dahlia sat at the small desk in the room they had given her, with a candle burning low and a sheet of clean parchment in front of her. And she wrote slowly and deliberately, the way she had learned to do everything since leaving Moonscar, without rushing, without letting anyone else's urgency become her own. She wrote that she would choose her own events. She wrote that she would set her own schedule, with adequate rest between performances at her sole discretion. She wrote that all payment from any event at which she performed would be given to her directly, in full, before she left the venue. She wrote that no carriage would arrive at her door without prior notice and written confirmation of her agreement. She wrote that the contract could be dissolved by her at any time, for any reason, without penalty or consequence. She read it back twice, added a clause about creative control, the right to choose what she sang and for how long, added another about her lodging remaining hers regardless of whether she agreed to any particular event. Then she sat back and looked at what she had written and waited for the voice that had spent 3 years telling her she was asking for too much. It didn't come. She folded the parchment, smoothed it flat, and went to find Ranulph. He read it without interrupting himself. Dahlia stood on the other side of the table and watched his face and found nothing to read there. Not the slight tightening around the eyes that meant a man was calculating how to negotiate. Not the patient stillness that preceded a gentle redirection. He simply read. When he reached the end, he looked up at her with the same expression he had worn in the marketplace. That quality of recognition, of a thing being exactly what it appeared to be. He picked up his pen. He signed it. "Your copy," he said, and slid it across the table. Then he produced a second sheet. She hadn't noticed him prepare it, but there it was, identical in every word. "My copy, for your seal." She looked at him. "You copied it," she said, "while you were reading yours." He held out the pen. "I told you I'd sign whatever you wrote, I meant it." She took the pen. She signed her name beneath his. She pressed her thumb to the wax he melted and sealed both copies, and when it was done she held her copy against her chest for a moment, with her eyes closed, and felt the specific, unfamiliar weight of a promise that had been made on her terms. It felt like putting her foot on solid ground after a very long time in water. "Thank you," she said. "Don't thank me yet," Ranulph said, and something warmer moved through his voice. Not quite amusement, not quite anticipation. Something in between. "Wait until after the first event." The first event was nothing like what she expected. She had expected a haul. She had expected the particular performance of wealth that alphas use to remind each other of their standing. The excess of food, the elaborate ceremony, the guests arranged in careful hierarchies of importance. She had expected to be positioned somewhere between entertainment and ornament, as she had always been. What Ranulph organized was different. The venue was large but unadorned. A great circular hall in the fortress itself, stone floors and high windows that let in the last of the evening light. The guests were alphas and their councils from 6 territories, seated at round tables rather than long ones, which meant no one sat above anyone else. There was food, good food, but served without theater. The atmosphere was— she searched for the right word as she stood in the wings and looked out at it. Serious. The gathering of people who had come for something real. Ranulph appeared at her shoulder. "They've heard about you," he said quietly. "Word travels faster than people think." "What have they heard?" "That there is a singer in the kingdom whose voice does something to the air." He glanced at her. "I may have confirmed this. You may have. I did. No apology in it. Just fact, delivered with that steady calm. You're ready?" It wasn't a question, but she answered it anyway. "Yes." She walked out. The hall noticed her the way halls always noticed her. A gradual shift in attention, conversations tapering, heads turning. She had learned not to wait for full silence. Full silence was something she created, not something she required before she began. She found her position at the center of the room, took one breath that went all the way down, and sang the first note. The conversation stopped. Not gradually. All at once, cleanly, the way a candle goes out in a sudden draft. The silence that followed that first note was the particular silence of people who had been caught entirely off guard by the scale of something, who had expected to be pleasantly entertained, and had instead been reached into, found, moved somewhere involuntary and profound. She sang for 40 minutes. She chose every song herself. She moved from power to tenderness and back again with the ease of someone walking familiar ground, reading the room the way she had always read rooms, giving it what it needed before it knew it needed it. At one point she looked out and saw a hardened alpha, gray-bearded, scarred, the kind of man who had the face of someone who hadn't wept publicly in 30 years, sitting very still with his jaw working and his eyes bright. She looked away before he noticed her noticing. When she finished, the silence lasted 3 full seconds. Then the hall erupted. Ranulph presented the payment to her in the reception room afterward, in a leather pouch that was heavier than her entire month of marketplace earnings. She stared at it. That's yours," he said simply. "Per the contract." She looked up at him. "This is more than 6 territories contributed. Each alpha paid attendance. Each alpha will tell 2 others." He said it with the even delivery of someone reporting facts. "This is what your gift is worth on an appropriate scale, Dahlia. This is what it was always worth." She sat down, not dramatically. Her legs simply decided they had been standing long enough. She sat in the chair beside the table and looked at the pouch in her hands and felt something move through her chest that was too large and too complicated to name in the moment. Not happiness exactly. More like the overwhelming sensation of a debt being repaid that you had stopped believing would ever be repaid. She thought of every event Norman had taken payment for without telling her, and every coin that had gone into his accounts while she sang herself hoarse for his reputation. Every time he had looked at her and said, "Your pack has a gift," and made her feel that the gift was not hers to own. "Why are you doing this?" she asked. Ranulph was quiet for a moment. He moved to the chair across from her and sat. And she noticed he did that. Sat when she sat. Adjusted the distance when she needed it. Managed the space between them with a consideration so natural she wondered if he was aware of it. "I had a sister," he said. He said it simply, without the weight people usually placed on sentences about the dead, as though he had made peace with it, and now it was simply true, simply part of him. The moon goddess blessed her with a voice, not like yours, different in quality, similar in nature, something that went beyond technique or training, something given. Dahlia held very still. she never had the chance to discover what it could be. Sickness took her before anyone thought to give her the conditions to find out. He paused. She spent her life singing in our great hall because it made the pack happy, and she was generous, and she didn't know yet to ask for more. She never knew what she was capable of. The fire in the hearth shifted, sent a brief warmth across the room. "Helping you," Ranulph said, "is what I imagine it would have felt like to help her, to see her dream complete itself." He looked at Dahlia steadily. "That's all it is. No hidden ledger. No debt you'll be asked to repay." Dahlia looked at him for a long time. She had become very good at finding the thing underneath, the calculation beneath the patience, the agenda beneath the generosity. She looked for it now with everything she had. She found a man who meant what he said. She found grief, old and integrated, and the particular purpose that sometimes grows in the space grief leaves. She found someone who had learned, through loss, not to waste what was precious. "This is real," some part of her said quietly. "This one is real." "I'm sorry about your sister," she said. "Thank you." He stood. "Rest. There will be more events if you want them. On your terms, on your schedule. Always." He moved toward the door. "The fortress is yours to move through freely. The staff will see to whatever you need." He paused at the door. "You sang something tonight I haven't heard before. The third song." "I wrote it," she said, "on the road, after I left my pack." He nodded slowly, as though this confirmed something. "It showed," he said. And then he was gone, and she was alone with the fire and the leather pouch and the enormous, unfamiliar quiet of a place that had asked nothing of her except to be exactly what she was. The months that followed were the first months of her adult life that belonged entirely to herself. Ranulph was true to every word in the contract. Events came to her as invitations, not summons, offered through the elderly man she had learned was called Wren, delivered with dates and details and always the addendum at your discretion. She accepted the ones that interested her. She declined the ones that didn't. No one came to her door at dawn. No carriage arrived unannounced. Her voice, freed from the cycle of depletion and forced recovery, became something she had not known it could be. She had always been gifted. She understood that now in a way she had not before. The difference between knowing you have something and understanding its true dimensions. It was like having lived in a single room and then discovering the room was the entrance hall. The voice that had cracked under Norman's impossible schedule opened now into registers she had never tested, sustained notes she had never trusted herself to hold, emotional territories she had never had the safety to explore publicly. She wrote new songs, many of them. She kept a journal of them in a small book Wren produced for her without being asked, and she filled it and asked for another and filled that one too. She began to understand what the moon goddess had given her. Not just a voice, an instrument for something larger, a capacity to reach into people and find the true thing, the undefended thing, the part that existed before performance and after it. She could do it in a great hall or in a marketplace, or she discovered one quiet afternoon in the fortress courtyard while sitting on a low wall with no audience at all. She could do it, and the doing of it filled her in a way that had nothing to do with applause or payment or anyone else's response. It was hers. It had always been hers. The scar on her throat faded to silver. She came to know Ranulph the way you come to know someone you see in ordinary moments, not the moments arranged for impression, but the small recurring ones that accumulate into a true picture. She knew he rose before dawn. She knew he took his meals simply and without ceremony. She knew he visited the training courtyard daily not to supervise but to participate, moving through drills alongside his wolves with the ease of someone who had never decided that authority excused him from the work. She knew he listened, not performatively. Actually listened the way he had listened in the marketplace, with his full attention committed and his own thoughts set aside. They fell into the habit of late evenings in the map room, not by arrangement, but by the natural coincidence of two people who were both awake when others weren't, both drawn to the quiet end of the day. She would bring tea, he would have reports he was finishing, and somewhere between the end of his work and the beginning of real tiredness they would talk. About the events, about the territories she was beginning to know through travel, about his sister occasionally, in the careful way of someone tending something precious, about her parents once on a night when the fire had burned low and the darkness made honesty easier. They chose wrong, he said simply when she finished. Oh, they were afraid, she said. People choose wrong when they're afraid, he said. That doesn't make it less wrong. She had looked at the fire and thought about that for a long time. Yes, she had thought finally. It doesn't. She didn't know then, exactly when it had shifted, when the gratitude had become something warmer and less easily categorized, when she had begun to notice the particular quality of his presence not as safety, but as something she actively sought. She suspected it had happened gradually, and then all at once, the way most real things happened. She knew it fully the evening he found her in the courtyard after a difficult rehearsal, when she had been pushing her voice into new territory, and had come up against the limit of it, and felt the old fear, the crack, the depletion, the ghost of Norman's schedule, rise in her chest like cold water. He had sat beside her on the low wall without speaking at first, just present, in the steady way he was always present. After a moment, the silence between them settled into something comfortable, the kind that didn't require filling. Then his eyes moved to her throat. She had grown accustomed to people looking at the scar, and then looking away. A rapid, polite retreat from something they didn't want to be caught noticing. Ranulph did neither. He looked at it with the quiet directness he brought to everything, and then he looked at her. Your neck, he said. Who did that to you? She had not spoken about it directly to anyone since leaving Moonscar. Not in the village. Not to Wren. Not in any of the late evenings in the map room, when conversation had moved close to the edges of her past without crossing into it. Something about the simplicity of the question, not what happened with its invitation to minimize, not I noticed you have a scar with its careful distance, but just who, made it easier than she expected. My alpha, she said. She told him then. Not everything at once. It came out the way things come out when they have been held for a long time, in pieces, not entirely in order. The court events and the unannounced carriages and the healer's warning. Her parents and the council seats, and the careful arithmetic they had made of their daughter's suffering. The morning she had refused, and kept refusing, and the assembly Norman had called, the way the hall had looked, and the faces she had grown up with all turned carefully away. She told him about kneeling on the stone floor, about the iron. He chose the throat deliberately, she said. He thought he could take it from me. The voice. He thought if he marked that place, it would diminish what was there. It didn't, Ranulph said. Not a question. No. She touched the silver scar briefly, the way she sometimes did without meaning to. The moon goddess doesn't give through the skin. He never understood that. He thought the gift was fragile because I was. She paused. I wasn't fragile. I was just alone. Ranulph was quiet for a long moment. The courtyard held the last of the day's warmth, the stone beneath them still faintly sun-warmed, the training yard empty and still. I'm sorry, he said, not with the slightly helpless quality that apology sometimes had, the sound of someone filling silence. He said it the way he said most things, because he meant it, precisely and without performance. I know, she said. They sat together in the quiet for a while longer. She was aware, distantly, that she felt lighter. Not fixed. She didn't believe in the kind of telling that fixed things. But lighter. The way a room feels lighter when a window is opened that has been closed too long. She looked at him sideways in the fading courtyard light and thought, with a clarity that surprised her with its simplicity. "I trust this person entirely." And then, a breath later, "Oh." He told her about the feast 3 weeks before it happened. Not as a surprise. Not as a fait accompli. He sat across from her in the map room and told her what he was planning and why, and asked if she was willing. "Every alpha in the region," he said, "all of them paying tribute to you. A formal acknowledgement in front of witnesses of what your gift means and what it is worth." She was quiet for a moment. "Norman will be there," she said. "Norman will be there," he confirmed. "His territory is in the region. He cannot decline an invitation from the Alpha King without consequences he cannot afford." She thought about the assembly hall, the iron, the stone floor under her knees, her parents' averted faces. "Yes," she said, "I'm willing." The night of the feast was the largest gathering she had ever sung for. The great hall had been prepared over days. Dahlia had watched it transform without being asked to involve herself in the preparations, had simply been told that when the night came, the room would be ready. It was. Long tables set with the kind of precision that communicated respect without excess. The wolf standards of every invited territory hanging from the rafters in the correct order of precedence. Torches in every bracket. The alphas arrived through the afternoon. She watched from an upper corridor as they came. Their councils and guards, and the careful dignity of powerful people in each other's company. She watched Norman arrive and felt something she had expected to feel as rage, and found instead was almost nothing. He looked smaller than she remembered. Not physically. He was the same man, the same flat eyes, and the same calculated bearing. But she had lived through things since the last time she saw him, and the scale of him had changed accordingly. "You thought the iron would diminish me," she thought, watching him cross the courtyard below. "You were so certain you understood what you were destroying." She felt Ranulph's presence before she heard him. That quality of warmth and solidity that she had come to know the way you know a familiar room in darkness. "Ready?" he said. "Yes," she said, and found she meant it completely. She walked into that hall differently than she had ever walked into any room. Not with the careful, managed presence of a woman trying not to take up too much space. Not with the performer's armor of projection and technique deployed to compensate for the vulnerability of being seen. She walked in as herself, wholly, unheld by anyone's assessment of her worth, undiminished by anyone's definition of her purpose. The room settled as she moved to the center of it. She saw Norman find her in the crowd and watched his expression go through several rapid adjustments. Recognition, recalculation, something that might have been the first understanding that he had badly miscalculated something. She sang. She gave them everything that night. Every register, every territory of emotion she had mapped in the months of freedom, every song she had written on the road and in the cottage and in the quiet pre-dawn hours of the fortress. She sang the one she had written the morning after she left Moonscar, raw with new loss and new air, and the terrifying open quality of a life suddenly without walls. She felt the room receive it, felt it move through the gathered alphas the way the best music always moved, past the defended places, and into the true ones. When she finished, and the last note dissolved, she looked out at the hall. Every person in it was standing. Every alpha, every council member, every wolf who had attended this feast for reasons of politics and alliance and territorial courtesy. All of them standing, the applause coming in that full immediate wave she had learned to recognize as the real thing. She found Norman in the crowd. He was standing too, his hands moving in the applause with the mechanical compliance of a man whose body had responded before his pride could stop it. His face was a careful arrangement of controlled expression over something rawer and less controlled. He looked like a man watching the thing he had destroyed stand up and continue anyway. Good, she thought, without particular heat. See it clearly. Ranulph moved to the center of the room. Tonight, he said, his voice carrying with the easy authority of a man who had never needed to raise it. "We honor a gift the moon goddess placed in this kingdom. A gift that was misread, diminished, and discarded by those who could not see past their own advantage." He didn't look at Norman. He didn't need to. "We correct that tonight." He looked at her. "Dahlia of the Moonscar Pack, this region owes you its gratitude." And then, one by one, the alphas came forward, each one in turn, with their tribute, coin in amounts that made the leather pouch from the first event feel small, and words of acknowledgement spoken publicly, in front of witnesses that could not be taken back. She stood and received each one with her chin level and her hands steady, and the silver scar at her throat catching the torchlight. Norman came last. He stood before her, and she could see the cost of it in every line of him, in the set of his jaw, the controlled evenness of his breath, the way his hands were very still at his sides. He placed his tribute on the table. He looked at her. She looked back. She didn't smile. She didn't need to. She simply looked at him with the clear, untroubled gaze of a woman who knew exactly who she was, and waited. He bowed. Not deeply. Norman was constitutionally incapable of deep bows. But he bowed, and it was witnessed by every alpha in the region, and when he straightened and walked away, she heard the small sound of something finishing. She didn't watch him leave. The hall emptied slowly, the way halls do after something real has happened. People reluctant to step out of the atmosphere of it. Conversations lingering. The particular warmth of a room where something has occurred that will be talked about for years. Dahlia found herself, eventually, at the far end of the hall near the high windows, the noise of departure fading behind her. She heard his footsteps and didn't turn until he was beside her. "Your parents were here," Ranulph said quietly. She had known. She had seen them arrive, her father standing straighter than she remembered, her mother dressed carefully, both of them wearing the uncertain expression of people who had come a long distance to reckon with something. She had felt their eyes on her throughout the evening, but had not sought them out. "I know," she said. "They want to speak with you." She was quiet for a moment. "Not tonight," she said. "Tonight is finished." He nodded. No argument, no gentle encouragement toward a resolution she hadn't chosen yet. Just acceptance, clean and immediate. She turned to look at him. The hall was nearly empty now. The torches burned lower. In the quieter light he looked. She let herself notice it fully, for the first time without the careful management she had applied to this particular awareness, like exactly what he was. A man who had seen her clearly from the beginning, and had never once tried to make her smaller. "Thank you," she said, "for all of it." "I told you. I know what you told me," she said, "about your sister. I know that's true and I know you meant it." She paused. "I'm thanking you anyway, for everything you did that went beyond that." He looked at her. "You built a life here," he said. "I made room, that's different." "Ranulph." "Yes." "Stop talking." Something shifted in his expression. That quality of recognition again, but warmer now, lit from inside. He looked at her for one long, still moment, and then he crossed the small distance between them and kissed her. It was not the kiss of someone making a move. It was the kiss of someone finally saying something true that had been true for a long time. She felt the warmth of it move through her chest the way her own voice moved through a room, from the inside out, filling the spaces she hadn't known were empty. She laughed against his mouth. Couldn't help it. Something between relief and joy and the particular lightness of a thing arriving exactly when it should. He laughed too. She felt it more than heard it, his forehead coming to rest against hers, both of them laughing quietly in the near-empty hall, like two people who had been very serious for a very long time and were glad to be done with it. "Dahlia," he said. Be my mate." She pulled back enough to look at him. Once she would have reached for the contract, for the terms written on paper, for the seal pressed into wax, for the protection of conditions agreed upon in advance. Once, that was the only kind of safety she had known how to build. But she looked at Ranulph now, at the steady warmth of him, the man who had dressed like no one in a marketplace and listened like someone who had nothing to prove, who had signed every word she wrote without negotiation, who had sat beside her on a low wall and asked who did that to you without flinching from the answer, who had given her months of freedom and called it simply making room. And she understood that some things could not be contracted. Trust this complete did not need a seal. She was not the woman who had knelt on a stone floor anymore. She was not the woman who had sent a carriage back empty and braced for consequences. She was not even the woman who had stood in this man's map room and slid a folded parchment across a table with shaking certainty. She was whole. Fully, quietly, irrevocably whole. And a whole woman knew the difference between a promise written in fear and a promise spoken in truth. "I'll always be a singer," she said. "I'll always put my gift first." "I wouldn't ask for anything less," he said. "I would hate anything less." She looked at him for one more moment. "Then yes," she said simply. He smiled, fully, unguarded, the smile of a man who had set aside the performing of authority, and was simply himself, in a near-empty hall, with the woman he had seen clearly from the beginning. She thought of the girl who had stood on a stone floor with a brand cooling at her throat, and believed she was finished. She thought of the road, the cottage, the marketplace, the seal she had almost thrown in the river. She thought of her voice rising through the trees on that third morning, whole and untouched, and entirely hers. He thought he could take what the moon goddess gave, she thought. He never understood what he was dealing with. She took Ranulph's hand, laced her fingers through his, felt the warmth of it settle into her the way the best things settle, not like acquisition, not like rescue, but like recognition, like coming home to a place you built yourself. If this story moved you, if Dahlia's voice reached something in you tonight, don't let this be the last time. Subscribe to this channel so you never miss a story. The next story is already waiting for you.